Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a great honour to close this debate from the dispatch box, and this is the first time I've done this. But for many people, perhaps what was memorable about this debate is not necessarily my contribution, but what has flashed into their minds in terms of a memory that it will be difficult to get rid of, which is a picture of the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle hoovering his carpets wearing less than an apron. But it is clear from this debate that although there is broad agreement across this House on where we need to get to, there is much disagreement about how to get there. Historically, energy efficiency has not been Britain's number one priority, with its temperate climate and plentiful supplies of fuel, whether that's wood, coal, or gas or oil. And therefore, for far too long, we have put up with, and indeed built, too many drafty houses. As the Honourable Member for Cheltenham has said in his thoughtful contribution, we really have to change the way in which we build houses. But times have changed and Britain has to change too, and energy prices have increased massively. And now we have a choice. We can either invest in a low-carbon economy using renewable sources of energy or wait for the gas to run out. And neither option is cheap, although the latter also comes at a price of making man-made irreversible climate change. In the UK, 13% of our total greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the way in which we heat our homes, but the inevitable increasing cost of fuel bills has put and will continue to put great strain on the incomes of the poorest households. People fully understand the urgency of this matter. In meetings in my constituency, I've spoken to people as old as people in their 80s and children as young as 5-year-olds about the importance of ensuring that we insulate our homes and we address the issue of fuel poverty. And I suspect that the passion that I have developed in relation to this issue has come from listening and learning from the people that I represent. And we have today had a number of very passionate and inspirational maiden speeches made by people who clearly have a great love for their constituencies. We heard from the Honourable Member for South Dorset, who, after congratulating Lord Jim Knight on his ennoblement, spoke of the great beauty of his constituency. He also told us of the 6 of his ancestors who were in this House before him. It seems one of them only spoke once in 32 years, and certainly we hope that he doesn't follow that tradition. The Honourable Member for South Ribble was the first woman to represent her area, and she paid tribute to her predecessor David Burrow, particularly his work in relation to HIV sufferers. We learnt that South Ribble is the home of the Chicago Town Pizza, as well as Leyland and large bird sanctuaries. I have no doubt that she will be a very effective voice for South Ribble in Westminster. And as for Wells, we heard from the new member for Wells. She eschewed tradition and decided to be controversial in that she claimed that her constituency was the most beautiful constituency in Britain. She also took the opportunity to take on the national grid and certainly seems to have strong campaigning spirit and steel. Talking of strong campaigning spirit and steel, the Honourable Member for Corby also made it clear that whilst she's in favour of nuclear power and onshore wind, it's not in her constituency. And as was suggested by the Right Honourable Member for Llanelli, perhaps the front bench could consider putting some large solar panels in Corby instead. The Honourable Member for Strangford Lough explained that although he was a unionist, he could in some circumstances feel comfortable talking about green politics. And he described his beautiful area and reminded me and my family of many of the visits that we've taken to his extraordinary constituency. But particularly we were reminded of Castle Ward, which in some ways perhaps also makes us think of the coalition. Castle Ward is a very odd building. It was a doomed marriage. One half of the building is in a classic Georgian style and the other is Strawberry Hill Gothic. It's up to members to decide which bit represents which political party. But the marriage was doomed and she went back to Scotland after only a few months, so perhaps there is a lesson to be learnt there. We also heard from members who have a large amount of experience and whose contributions have been profound and very important. We heard from my honourable friend from Llanelli, who spoke of the cuts to funding to the Welsh Assembly and the impact that it may well have on the Welsh boiler scrappage scheme and on Warm Front. My honourable friend from Sheffield Heeley, who spoke about the feed-in tariff threshold, and she called for the FIT to be for 3 kilowatt appliances. We heard from my honourable friend from Brent North, who spoke passionately about how climate change has become his own political priority, and he strongly urged the government to reduce VAT on energy efficiency work in homes. We heard from the Honourable Member for Bournemouth East, who I understand has now got a record number of interventions in one of his speeches. We heard from my honourable friend from Dunfermline and West Fife, who made a very knowledgeable contribution about his power station in his constituency and the bid for CCS, and he asked the Minister to make a decision about when the competition is going to happen. We heard from the Honourable Member from Morecambe and Lonsdale, who was burnishing his pro-nuclear credentials and anti-onshore wind credentials, and I suspect is going to make a friend of the Honourable Member for Corby. We heard from my honourable friend from Liverpool, Waverley, who made a plea for energy-efficient windows. We also heard from, I've forgotten the Honourable Lady's constituency, but who was promoting ground source heat pumps that are made within her constituency. My honourable friend from Derby North, who asked the Chancellor to think again. We all asked the Chancellor to think again. And we heard from the Honourable Member for Brighton Pavilion, who made a wide-ranging and well-informed speech, and particularly called for mandatory minimum standards of insulation. And I know that the contributions that she made will be taken very seriously within this House. Much of what the government did in relation to this issue has had broad support from this place, and I'm proud of the progress that our government made on this issue. Particularly, of course, it begins with the 2008 Climate Change Act, which will be seen as one of Labour's greatest achievements, but ironically, only if the coalition government takes the Act's attendant low-carbon transition plans and the carbon budget seriously. Lord Turner, the chair of the CCC, said on the Today programme this morning, the last government set out a series of policies. As long as we drive those through, we will make a difference. And I was reassured to hear from someone who has as profound an understanding as the Honourable Member for Southampton that the CCC's report recognises the government's achievements. It is very important that we cut our household sector emissions, and it is a very, very important part of the plan. We are expecting to cut household emissions by 29%. In furtherance of this goal, we have insulated 5 million homes, and building on that, then went on to introduce CERT. And of course, it is greatly to be welcomed that the government has reconfirmed the decision to extend CERT to December 2012. I'm very pleased to hear from the Honourable Member of Bexley and Battle that is what is going to happen. But then really the next question is, what about CESP? What about CESP, which focused on household energy efficiency in poor areas and worked on a house-by-house, street-by-street basis? A precursor to CESP was established in the constituency of my honourable friend for North Tyneside, who also made his maiden speech today. It was called Warm Zone in his area, and he rightly told us of the great benefits that it has made to those in fuel poverty within his constituency. And then there's the Decent Homes programme, which has made housing estates in constituencies like mine full of flats that are now warm, decent and dry. I'm proud of the fact that the SAP ratings increased in the private sector and in the social rented sector since 1997 under a Labour government, with the social sector improving more and faster. But another, of course, priority under Labour was to fight fuel poverty, and the question was asked by the Honourable Member for Tamworth why it was that fuel poverty went up under a Labour government, to which my right honourable friend, the member for Lewisham East, explained that of course it was because of an unprecedented rise in fuel prices. Nevertheless, without government measures, the number of fuel-poor households would have been around 400,000 to 800,000 more than in England in 2008. What about Warmfront? What about Warmfront? Our flagship policy of Warmfront gave grants for energy efficiency to the most vulnerable households. What about Warmfront? And on these benches, we're very concerned about the future of it, and then the priority that the coalition will give to those in fuel poverty as a whole. The Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle says that his new policies are game changers, that they are new innovations. Well, if they are, and if they work, then we will of course support them. If they will keep to our carbon reduction plans and time is not being wasted, if they are coherent and an effective strategy, if they fulfil the needs of the poor, then the government will have our support. But if, as we fear, this government is prepared to sacrifice all for the sake of short-term savings, ignoring the long-term need, then they will have a fight on their hands. We greatly welcome the extension of CERT, but does the coalition believe that this is the game changer that will really help the fuel poor? How many in fuel poverty does the government expect will be helped as a result of the extension of CERT? Could the Right Honourable Member for Wealdon clarify, is the super priority group of 15% in addition to the 40% priority group or contained within it? Is CERT going to be enough by itself to fight fuel poverty? In January, the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells said grant programmes are going to be maintained. That's good news, perhaps, because Warmfront is a grant programme. Does that mean that the government is thinking again about Warmfront, and will we get Warmfront to help the fuel poor, because CERT will not be enough? I have gabbled on, and I do appreciate that I've spoken very fast, and I have, I'm afraid, another 3 pages but I promise I will not. It is odd to be at the dispatch box and to be the only ones who are on a time limit on the amount of time that we have. But it is essentially this. The job that the gentlemen have on the other side of the bench is an extremely difficult one, and you will certainly have our support if you do it within the parameters that we have set out in this speech. What about the fuel poor, and will you really be cutting carbon? If you do, you will have our support. Otherwise, you will not.
Start.